I'm a Canadian. My name is Greg. I'm so excited to do this interview today. As a reminder, I have started a Patreon. So if you want to keep content like this alive, go over to my Patreon, patreon.com/GregWycliffe. Now, to set up this interview, I want to tell you how this all started. Essentially, I sent out a tweet a week or so ago about the ongoing mandates, because people are talking about how the mandates have been dropped. All the work mandates have been dropped. And I sent out a tweet. I sent out a survey to say, hey, who's still experiencing mandates at work? Who still needs 2 jabs to go to work? And I posted this on Instagram as well, and it got hundreds and hundreds of responses, different stories in different industries, spanning, you name it, telecom, banks, firefighters, nurses, of course, which I've covered before on the channel. But I got a message from a brave individual from one of the major banks, and he said, hey, here's my story. And we're going to go over his whole story today. But the crazy thing at the end of it is he got terminated when everyone was still working from home. So, and I like to emphasize that point because it really doesn't make any sense. So we're going to introduce him in just a second here. But to give you an idea, this individual is 31 years old. He's an HR professional for 10 years in Canada, mostly Toronto. He's got a BCom, major in HR, minor in law from Ryerson University. He worked at IBM, Rogers Communications, and most recently CIBC, where CIBC, before being terminated from working from home during the pandemic. Without further ado, let's get him on here. Mr. Austin Cisco, thank you so much for joining us. There he is. How you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm doing all right. Yeah, your story is, we're going to get into the nitty gritty details, of course. But, first and foremost, you're going public with this, and
yep.
It's been a pretty crazy couple of years, families being ripped and torn apart, people losing their jobs. And there's, unfortunately, this culture of silence, don't ask, don't tell, don't make any sound. So first and foremost, like, you're making the decision to go public on this. That takes a lot of bravery. Where does that come from? Like, was there a moment for you to decide to go public, or?
Yeah, so no, it's a good question. So I've thought about it for probably since it started happening. But obviously I was still employed at the bank, was still trying to weigh out my options. Sometimes going public and being open about this stuff can actually kind of hurt your position. But I think as the last year sort of went on, we saw lots of people speaking up, sharing their experiences about the mandates and some of the heavy-handed decisions that employers were making. And my perspective was that majority of the ones that we were hearing about, ones that people who were maybe on the side of mandates kind of agreed with them, they understood the logic, right? If you're a nurse working in a long-term care facility, you got to be vaccinated. I still have my own views on other industries and what they did, and certainly don't agree with mandates. But, you at least could sort of understand the logic behind it. And you heard a lot of those stories, right? Doctors, nurses, firefighters, etc. But what I didn't hear much about was people in my kind of situation, where I was working from home, right? Which is the bizarre thing about all this is I was working from home for 2 years. Since February 2020 was the last time I was in the office. And then in March, worked from home, continued working from home up until my dismissal. So for me, going public with it and kind of talking about it is really just to bring more awareness to some of the insanity behind these decisions, right? And I think, over the last year, talking with friends and family about my circumstance and what I went through, talking to people who were supportive of the mandates, agreed with them. But when they heard my story, they were like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, they're like, there's no way, there has to be more to it. I'm like, there really isn't, right? And I think that there's a lot to do with my situation and being in HR, and just my experiences, my education gives me a bit of a unique perspective from an employment law standpoint, from what employers can and can't do, right? That gray area, like what they should have done, what would have been reasonable, all that sort of stuff. So for me, it's really just to share my experience, to give people more awareness that, hey, it's not just those who are working in long-term care or in high-risk settings who were got terminated for not being vaccinated. It was those who worked from home and didn't agree with certain, COVID related policies. So really, not much beyond that, just sharing my experience and then kind of letting people know that situations such as mine did happen. And we'll get into it, as the whole story. So I don't know where you want to start.
Yeah. No, that is a good point. You want to speak out to let people know just how absurd it is. How absurd is it? Well, they'll fire you even when you work from home, even when there's really no argument to be made about health or safety whatsoever. So where are we going to begin? Let's begin at the beginning because, to give people a timeline around last year, like this time last year is more or less like the fall is when, corporate mandates were kind of coming down in a lot of places. And this is mandates of you need to get the jab to keep your job, or, a lot of different conversations or different kind of mandates coming at different companies. But this started to come down at your organization, CIBC, and you sent the first email. You kind of came out and spoke up for the first time. And, tell me what writing that first email was like. Were you afraid to speak out at all? And also, what did that email include?
So we can go back to the start. So to your point, it would have been August of last year, so 2021. CIBC, along with all of the other major FIs, decided to put out an announcement that all employees must be vaccinated by a particular date. The CIBC's was October 31st of 2021. The unfortunate thing with that wording in that announcement is there was no context or information provided about what would happen come October 31st if you were not vaccinated. It didn't talk about what the exemption process would be for religious or medical reasons. It didn't talk about if there was any differentiation between working on site, like let's say you're a bank teller where you're facing clients, which you can kind of understand the logic, right? Maybe you do need to be vaccinated, at least from their standpoint, right? But there was no mention of if you worked from home, if this was going to matter, right? So it was just, you need to be vaccinated. All employees are required to be vaccinated by October 31st. So that was obviously unsettling, given my position. I thought, nothing is happening concretely yet. Let's just kind of wait this out. They were certainly targeting the people who were in the office first, right? The people who never went home, right? The bank tellers, the back office admin people who were, in the office, couldn't do their job from home, right? They focused on getting their information first and, applying those COVID policies. But come October, they started asking all employees, right, to complete kind of an attestation. And you and I talked about what is an attestation, right? And it's kind of, I don't know if you have the definition there, but the attestation, if you have it, right, like an attestation, people are confused, what is an attestation, right? Were they just asking you to disclose your status, or were they doing more? So as you can see there, it's a legal document and a certifiable document, basically where you would acknowledge having done something or you're agreeing to something, right? So it's effectively kind of a contract or an extension of your employment contract, right? Depending on the wording in the attestation. So they were asking all employees, regardless of where you worked, to complete the attestation. And that attestation, you had to disclose your status. So you had to say, I am vaccinated, I am not vaccinated, or I choose not to disclose. So that was actually a third option that not all banks did. Some banks just said, you have to say yes or no, I am or I'm not. But the bank, CIBC said you choose not to disclose, which on surface, it's like, oh, that's nice, right? They're not forcing me to disclose. I can say I choose not to disclose. I could be vaccinated. I might not be. But the problem with the attestation that at least I saw was that it was what you were agreeing to, even if you selected, I choose not to disclose. So by choosing not to disclose, you're still completing the attestation and you are agreeing to the terms that are in that attestation. And some of the wording in there was a bit kind of confusing, and I had some questions around it because it said, by completing this attestation, again, even if you choose not to disclose, you are agreeing to have your information used, disclosed, shared in whatever manner they deem necessary, as well as to agree to whatever health and safety protocols they deem necessary, right, to manage the pandemic, which also would include possibly maintaining a fully vaccinated status, right, including boosters, right? So they did make a comment about that. So for me, I'm not vaccinated. I chose not to for a variety of reasons. That's a whole other topic, but I just wasn't comfortable sharing that information to begin with, right? Because to me, I thought in my head, okay, I work from home, right? I'm not going back into the office anytime soon. This is a private medical, question. We've tiptoed around anything like that in my entire career. We were very sensitive about asking people medical information, if they have disabilities, all that sort of stuff. And then also, I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to, right? Even if I chose not to disclose, am I agreeing to follow whatever health and safety protocols? But they weren't telling us what those health and safety protocols would be. Like, so what am I agreeing to, right? So I had questions. So I guess that gets to your question about like, what was that first email? So
sorry, I just want to interject for one quick moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yep. So an attestation, the definition is certifiable legal document that provides irrefutable proof that an employee did or not take an action. Like historically, an attestation, it sounds like, deals with like a very kind of specific scenario for a specific, employee. And I want to clarify, because especially during the past couple of years, it seems that some words take on new meaning. Like, for example, vaccination used to mean like immunity, but they kind of changed that definition. The CDC changed that definition, if I'm not mistaken, or the WHO did, to not even include immunity, just might protect you or hopefully protect you. And is there a similar thing here with attestation, as in this is the first time an attestation is kind of being presented as, oh, by the way, you also are going to agree with health and safety protocols into the future? Like, is that a unique thing in this scenario, would you say?
At least in my experience, I've never seen it used in this kind of circumstance. I've seen attestations used in HR and in the corporate world. And the only times I've seen it being used is when, like, I'll give an example. Let's say an employee, sends emails to their personal email from their work email, right? So they sent something home to their personal email. They wanted to read it, whatever. And let's say it was company property, right? Company data. Or like a company's, document. Okay. We would find out about it. We would say, hey, look, you can't be sending, corporate stuff home. You need to delete it. In order for us to confirm that you have in fact deleted and you didn't, disclose it or share it elsewhere or have it stored, you need to sign this attestation. You need to sign off and say, I deleted it. I did this. I don't have any more copies. I never distributed it. So that's where I've seen it, right? Again, because that employee would be certifying that they did not do anything with it, that it's destroyed. But what was interesting about this attestation is not just that it's unique, that I've never seen it with respect to kind of amending your employment contract or agreeing to new employment terms. It was the inability for them to just like confirm to me if it was in fact an extension of my employment agreement, right? Because I was asking questions, and that's what drove me to my email saying, hey, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with this, and even if I'm comfortable with the whole mandate as it's being rolled out, like I have some concerns from a legal perspective. From an ethical or a moral standpoint as well. So that's kind of what brought me to raise my concerns and send them an email, which I kind of escalated up and said, here's my concerns. Here's what I'm hesitant about. I'd welcome a discussion if there's a learning opportunity for me to learn more about the laws, or maybe I've missed something, like educate me. If I'm wrong, I've been wrong before, right? I've misinterpreted certain laws or guidelines or policies before. And that's why, you talk with your one-ups or your management team to get clarity, right? Which is kind of what led me to that email. So I think that's kind of back to your question, right? About like, was I scared? Like, why did I do it? Like, what did it contain? So you want to kind of talk about that email a bit?
Yeah, this first email, or maybe we should go over kind of just to clarify for everyone who's watching. This is Austin. He got fired from CIBC. He was working from home. Most people were working from home at the time. And we're kind of going over the play-by-play that happened for himself. And this might apply to you or anyone else who is still working in a big corporate environment, because it's not just, hey, did you get the jab or not? It turns out that, this attestation that they made employees sign might have had a lot of other stipulations. And because Austin is an educated and high-performing HR professional, you were on top of this, about employment law. And it sounds like this attestation, I'm going to get the problems with, the 4 problems with this attestation, just to clarify for people.
You bring up a good point about, excuse me, the concerns I had, right? Because I thought even if I chose not to disclose, that I was agreeing to something, right? And I didn't want to blindly agree, right, to future policies that I might not agree with. And then let's say I sign off the attestation, I choose not to disclose, and it says by completing this, you're agreeing to follow whatever policies we need. And then let's say they implement a policy that I then don't agree with, right? Like testing, for example. Maybe I wasn't comfortable with testing.
Sure.
Valid concern, or mask use at all times, or whatever policies or procedures they were going to put in place. They weren't telling us what that was. And my concern was that if I agree in this attestation, and then at a later date, they say, okay, hey, you agreed to follow the policies because you didn't do the attestation. You got to follow this. And then I say, no, did I just set myself up for them to actually terminate me for cause justifiably? Because I agreed, right? If I agreed to, it'd be like if you worked in a job, a heavy machine operator, and you agreed to drug testing as a condition of employment, right? It happens, it's common. And then you said, no, I'm not doing the drug testing, they could fire you, right? Because you agreed as a condition of employment to follow, X and Y, policy, right? So there's that. The second aspect of it was for those who did get vaccinated, right? And they said on that attestation, yes, I'm vaccinated. In that attestation, it made a comment about it being required to maintain a fully vaccinated status as defined by public health, including boosters. So my thought was, and again, I asked them bluntly this question. I didn't get a clear answer because I think it's a valid question, is that if I was vaccinated, I complete the attestation saying I am, and I agree to everything in that attestation. And at a future date, they say you need a booster, right? Similar to what Western University is doing, right, with their vaccine mandate and talking about boosters now as a requirement to go to school. What if your employer now does it? And if you said, no, I was done it too, I don't want a third. They said, well, you agreed to a third as a condition of employment. So if you don't, you're now terminated for cause, and you've agreed, right? So that was my concern, was that am I and others agreeing to, future conditions that could really put us in a position where they could terminate us reasonably for cause, right? So again, that's my theory, my understanding. I asked them this bluntly, did not really get a concrete answer, but was ultimately terminated for not agreeing. So it kind of seemed to be that's how it played out. So you have the problems with the attestation there. So my first one is
hold on. Is there any evidence of that being the case yet, in terms of an attestation being like, oh yeah, it wasn't just us asking for your vaccination status. It was us kind of getting you to agree to, you will be fully vaccinated with boosters into the future, or else we will fire you.
Not that I've seen or heard yet, right? They haven't talked about boosters. I haven't heard anything like that. And what's ironic is all of those additional protocols that they said we need to agree to are currently on hold, paused, don't exist, right? So there's no testing policy. There's no mask use policy in the office. There's no requirement to be vaccinated to be considered for jobs. So there was for a window of like October, November until the spring. And then they dropped it all, right? Because they realized that the policies didn't really make sense. They weren't effective in protecting employees' health, and that they were, I suspect they know that they were discriminatory and a violation of people's privacy.
Yeah.
So they pulled back, right? So there's no evidence now that this attestation could cause further issues, but time will tell. We'll see this winter, right?
Yeah. And that came up a lot when I was asking people about mandates. Because when I first kind of made the survey, it's like, were the mandates dropped? Are they being enforced? Is it a gray area? And someone immediately said, Greg, you need to put an option on there that says they were suspended. And it's like, isn't that kind of creepy language to use? It's like, yeah, it's just temporarily suspended, and kind of implying it's gonna come back, So that's concerning.
Right. Well, now everyone who's completed the attestation has no recourse, right? They've agreed, right? They've like, my view was they created new conditions of employment, right? Yep. New requirements for your job that to me are not actually required for the job. So even forgetting about COVID or any kind of that sort of stuff, if you make any changes to the conditions of someone's employment, so this is just from like employment law, HR, right? If you make any changes, right, whatever it may be, it has to be a bona fide occupational requirement, meaning whatever changes has to be justified as necessary for the job, right? Like I can't say, Greg, as a condition of employment, working at home, you need to, be drug tested, right? That's a perfect example. You'd be like, that's not required. Like, I don't need that for safety. There's no need for it. So for me, like, there was no justifiable reason for them to even ask, for this information to begin with, let alone impose these policies, because I could do my job effectively at home, right? The on-site, the bank tellers, anyone who could not work from home, it's a bit of a different story. I still have different views on that, but certainly anyone who could and did work from home, there was no need to ask, right? And that, to me, that was a violation of privacy, right? My entire career, like I said, we've tiptoed around any kind of medical information to do with employees. It's highly sensitive. If they have an accommodation request because they have medical issues, it's kept very private. We have a whole process, and that's how it should be, right? You got to protect people's privacy. So my concern in sending this email is I felt there's two reasons why I sent the email to my leadership. One was I'm an HR professional, and I felt in my job at the bank, if I felt we were doing something illegal, unethical, whatever, that I have a duty to call it out and ask questions and get clarity. Because if that's what you would expect a good employee to do, right? If someone is doing something that you suspect is illegal or going to get us into trouble or violates employees' rights, you call it out. So I was concerned as an HR professional wanting to get clarity, and then also just concerned as an individual because it was going to impact me. So certainly when I was writing that email, I was concerned of one, the reputational impact it was going to have on me. I was concerned that I might be retaliated against, right? Like terminated for speaking up. At that point, based on the direction of where things were going, I kind of saw the writing on the wall, and I thought, you know what? I can't in good conscience not say something and at least not try to get clarity, right? At least say, hey, here's my concerns. Here's what I think the legal issues are. Here's what I'm worried about. Like, help me understand, like, what's going on. And also, can you answer my questions about the attestation? Am I signing a new employment agreement? Like, just yes or no. Is this, like, if I accept this and then I disagree with testing 3 months from now, if that becomes a policy, am I going to get terminated for cause? But they wouldn't answer that, right? So in my email, I listed off, I'm looking at it here, just a number of different laws, right? PIPEDA, criminal code regarding consent, a whole list of things that I felt is where we kind of, right, you have them listed there, right? That's just kind of the surface, right? Anyone who wants to see that, read into it. You'll see, once you start reading it, you'll see how it relates to kind of my concerns. So I shared that, and I also shared my concerns that this was really one, a privacy issue because you're asking employees for medical information, and then two, it's discriminatory, right? Because you're effectively saying, hey, everyone, tell us your status. And they would argue, well, you can choose not to disclose, but they even said if you choose not to disclose, be treated as unvaccinated because they couldn't confirm, right? If I didn't answer, if I chose not to disclose or I ignored the survey, which I did, they would have to deem me as unvaccinated, right? Which is fair, right? They can't confirm that I am, so they're going to treat me as unvaccinated. But the discriminatory aspect comes from they're taking this information, right? This medical information that they had no right to ask for, at least for those working from home, because it's not required for the job. And then they're taking what you answered, Greg, and what I answered and said, okay, Greg, if you said you're vaccinated, you're going to follow this set of policies. And Austin, chose not to disclose, you didn't respond, you're going to follow this set of policies. And the policies that they were talking about and the procedures were going to be different based on your medical choices and what you responded to. So to me, I was like, is that not like the definition of discrimination? Is you're applying different policies to different sets of people based on their medical choices, right? It's not like, hey, we need the information that everyone's going to have to be tested, everyone's going to have to wear a mask. It wasn't that at all, right? So I shared that email. It led to a phone conversation with one of my executives, which really didn't go anywhere. It was very much kind of like a circular conversation. And anyone who's watching or listening right now, when people ask politicians questions and they don't even answer it, they just kind of like, they say the talking points. That's kind of what it was, right? It was, well, all the banks are doing it. Like it was almost verbatim that, right? All the banks are doing it. Legal would have been involved. They wouldn't have signed off on this if it was going to get us into trouble. But I still said, well, what about, like, what do you think? Like, what's your interpretation of the law? No answer. And it basically came down to my executive at the time saying, is this the hill you want to die on? And I will let you know if your position puts you in harm's way. Right. So to me, like, it's pretty strong language. I'm like, okay, like, am I like to die on this hill, like terminated. Like, what does that mean? So obviously after that, a bit unsettling. And from that email, we kind of left it as asking everyone. I still said I think it's a privacy issue, and they said, well, we're not sure what these policies are going to be, right? The ones that I said might be discriminatory, right? We don't know. They haven't been rolled out yet. We're just talking about it. This was mid-October. And they said, let's not debate whether they're discriminatory or not because we don't know what they are. And I said, okay, that's fair, right? Let's just wait. Right, so let's wait, see what happens. And then things just kind of sat. And I ignored the deadline of October 31st, not knowing if it was going to lead to my termination. Again, at that point, they did not say, come October 31st, this is what's going to happen. They just said, okay, if you don't complete the attestation, we're going to treat you as unvaccinated. I said, okay, that's fair. Like, you can treat me however you want. I'm still working from home. There's no immediate implications to my employment now. Although it's obviously at that point was very unsettling because I still had a long list of questions I was asking them and not really getting responses to. So that kind of got us to the next part. So maybe I'll just pause there because before we get into kind of when they started listing out the policies, I know we talked about the attestation, my concerns on it. So maybe I'll just
There's a few things I wanted to draw attention to there. I think we might have kind of got a little bit choppy there. Are we still here, folks? Let us know if the stream is still good.
Chopping around, but I think it's a bit smoother now.
Yeah. So I first want to say, I mean, you are a HR professional, and obviously these mandates that came down are totally new and totally unprecedented, to borrow a term, and I just find it so fascinating that you are the guy to be asking questions. Like, it seems you are the only guy who's asking these questions, very fair questions, like what are the alternatives for people who aren't going to do this? Like, what are the ramifications for someone who's,
valid questions,
very valid questions. And of course it's unfortunate that they weren't really met with any answers, but I think we kind of just went over this, but more or less you were right on the money in terms of, hey, this looks like it's going to be discriminatory. And you called out your boss for that, or your higher ups rather. And that ended up being true down the road when kind of testing for the unvaccinated came to be. So you were right on the money, in other words.
So it did end up happening. You're right. So basically into November, right? So the deadline passed, right? Anyone who didn't respond or who wasn't vaccinated, again, no communication. And for me, even being in HR, right? Like, usually we have a heads up to a lot of stuff. We're privy to more things at a corporate level about announcements, decisions, particularly decisions impacting employees, right?
Sure.
Like, we're always in the loop where we have strategy sessions, communication sessions about what's going to be discussed, what emails are going to go out. We were kept in the dark for most of it. So you asked, like, the question or made the comment, like, was any, like, I was the only one speaking out. At least that's my only perspective. We would have weekly or bi-weekly large HR calls with leadership talking about this, and no one was really making comments. Right? Some people would, right? And they would post it anonymously, but they wouldn't answer the questions. They would just kind of pick and choose what to respond to on these calls. So I don't know, like, I know other people, like my colleagues, were very frustrated with the lack of communication from our leadership because we're facing the business, right? So just to give maybe a quick context about the type of HR job I was in, right? Because people probably listening to this, they hear HR and they're like, well, what is HR? Do they just hire people, fire people? So I'll be very quick as I can in describing kind of my role in HR and what HR does. So if you think of HR, I explained this to you, Greg, it's like, to me, HR is anything to do with the employee and employer relationship. It's a very basic thing, right? So that includes recruiting, hiring, making offers, training them, developing them, managing their performance, dealing with their payroll, dealing with their benefits, dealing with their pension, investigating them for misconduct, letting people go, restructuring. All this kind of stuff falls under the umbrella of HR, right? And these large companies, they have very large HR teams, right? So they have people doing payroll, right? Just people doing payroll, just people doing benefits, just people doing compensation, right? Designing bonus plans and salary plans and all this other stuff.
And this would be HR people who specifically focus on this one kind of silo
they're pillars, right? Pillars. And in a small company, you'd have like one or two HR people that do all of it, right? But in the large corporate environment, it's kind of siloed. And And HR, it all reports under HR, but then they have people in my type of role, which is kind of an HR business partner, HR consultant, HR manager. It's all kind of interchangeable. And basically, we are called HR generalists, right? So we're supposed to know, a good foundation of all the areas of HR because we've been exposed to it, right? We kind of understand payroll and benefits and hiring people and letting them go. Like we're supposed to be kind of the experts in a little bit of everything. And then what we're do is we're deployed and we're given a part of the business. And basically there's multiple people like me in my role, and between all of us, we all kind of cover off a section of the business, and we are the face of HR for them.
Okay.
I think I froze there. Hang on.
No, I can see you.
Okay, it's frozen my mind. As long as the video is good for you guys.
No, it's looking good.
I was like the face of HR for them, right? Any kind of HR questions that came up, I would deal with, right? So that's kind of my role within HR, because I know not everyone understands kind of like why I would be privy to certain stuff. But
can I ask you? We got a question actually from a viewer that's pretty interesting. Sure. What if your initial employment contract says something along the lines of, quote, "You agree to abide by all present and future company policies"? Doesn't that set you up pretty much for any JAB policy?
My gut feeling is it's a gray area. I think that at the end of the day, any policy or anything that you're agreeing to has to be reasonable for the role, right? It has to be a requirement for the job. So I think that if they could justify any change or any policy that says this makes sense for your job and you've agreed to it, then probably you're bound by it. But in this instance, right, where they're asking people to be tested or to get vaccinated, even work from home, to me it's not justified. So that type of language in an employment contract or whatever may set you up for that, but I don't think it means that they can just arbitrarily add in a policy. Like what if they said, hey, it's a mental health pandemic, we need all employees to start taking Prozac, right? Like they can't, that's not justifiable, it's not right, they can't do that. So even if you agreed, I think it still needs to be a reasonable policy or whatever it is going forward.
Right.
Greg, I'm still frozen on my end. Hang on here.
You're looking great over here, man. You're looking great over here. So don't sweat it. Don't sweat it.
Okay. Yeah, we'll just leave it that. Okay, if I kind of just speak up, I just see my face and your face frozen. So,
no worries.
So this brought us to, like I was explaining that, I was privy to this stuff. My colleagues were frustrated with the lack of communication, the lack of heads up to these changes. But inevitably, they did end up going forward with these discriminatory policies, or at least that's how I viewed them, which was, if you said you're not vaccinated or you chose not to disclose, did not complete the attestation like I did, you will have to follow these sets of policies. And if you said, yes, I am vaccinated, you follow this set of policies, right? So two distinct set of policies that people would have to follow. And I don't remember all the exact details and the nuanced stuff, but there were two main things. One was around mask use, and the other was testing. Mm-hmm. So again, I don't have the policies in front of me. I don't recall exactly what they said, but in effect, the mask use one between the two groups had the unvaccinated or those who chose not to disclose having fewer opportunities to take off their mask in the office, meaning I think it was only allowed to take off your mask at your desk while eating, but all other times you must keep it on, including common areas, where if you're vaccinated, you can take off your mask in common areas. You can take off your mask in meeting rooms. So to me, I'm like, that's very unsettling. Like, what, if I go into the office, am I like, I got a badge like to show everyone like that I wasn't vaccinated? So that was kind of unsettling. And then the testing, right? So the policy was going to be that when I was coming into the office, or if anyone who was unvaccinated chose not to disclose or didn't complete the attestation, they would have to do a test. To be testing twice a week before they come in, while the vaccinated would not have to, right? And at this time, like, it's more widely known now that regardless if you got it or not, you're able to transmit. So to me, I was like, there's kind of some broken logic there. Like, I don't understand. So once they said, here are the policies, that's when I said, okay, I have a lot of questions, right? Who's paying for the testing, right? Who's enforcing it? Am I going to walk into a CIBC office and have to go see a nurse who's going to swab me before I can go to my desk? Is that what's going to happen? Right. And they started making comments about these policies without really being able to provide answers, right? So I asked questions like, are you guys paying for the tests? They said, well, we don't know. You might have to. I'm like, well, I can't agree to something if I'm going to have to pay for it, or if I don't know who has access to the results or how they're going to be stored, or is it done on site, right? Do I go in, and if I test positive, do I go home, right? And people see me like walk home like, hey, I just had coffee with Austin. Why isn't he in the office? Like, oh, he must have had COVID, like, right? Or just the fact that like they would know that before I enter the office, if I'm getting tested, that I clearly am not vaccinated, which is again a privacy issue. So I was asking them questions around this. They didn't have answers. I also asked questions about like, is there any consideration for natural immunity? Is there any redeployment or option to continue working from home while we kind of figure this out, right? Because if you work from home, right, or if you're in a job that's a permanent work from home job, then really like why do you need to agree to testing and mask use if you're going to be at home? And then ultimately, like what happens if I don't agree, right? Like, are you making testing and mask use a condition of employment, right? Like, and if I don't follow, will I be terminated? Right. So I was asking all these questions. I thought they were very valid. I still think they're very valid questions. And I wasn't getting clear answers. And I said, well, look, it's not that I won't agree or complete the attestation. I really want to know what it is that I'm signing, what it is that I'm agreeing to, and what the implications are if I don't agree. Right. And they would not respond. Like sorry, that's not true. They would respond, but they would not address my questions directly. They would just say, it's for health and safety. We need this information to make decisions around policy. The answers that you want are in the FAQs. They weren't. So it was just kind of this back and forth, and similar to the conversations I had with them in October, it was just a circular conversation, right? Where it was, I was just kind of met with the same talking points. And when I started to get smarter and I was putting it in writing, being like, please respond to this, like, just like, help put my mind at ease, or even if it's an answer I don't want, just confirm. And ultimately, when I kept pushing, they said no. Like they said, this is a condition of employment. There is no option to not complete the attestation, and there is no option not to agree. And then ultimately, if you don't agree to these new terms and these new rules that we're defining, you're placed on unpaid leave and subsequently dismissed, regardless if you're home or not.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really like kind of where it kind of brought us into the December timeframe of all this back and forth. And again, it just their inability to just respond to they're very valid questions. They just wouldn't respond, and it was just kind of like ignoring it to the point of me obviously feeling very unsettled, losing sleep, under a tremendous amount of stress, not knowing if I was going to lose my job or not. It led to me leaving Toronto. I lived there for 10 years. So I moved there when I was 19 for school. Actually, I was there more than 10 years because I left in my 30s. Having to move back to my parents' house out of Toronto because I was like, what if I get fired and I got rent to pay, I got bills, I can't afford this. Like, this is a difficult decision. So I effectively uprooted my life, moved back home, left all my friends in Toronto. In addition to all the other stuff that the passports were kind of causing, right? No gym, no restaurants, no hockey, no sports. So yeah, that kind of led me to December. So maybe I'll pause there because we can get into the rest of the timeline and what led to the dismissal. But maybe, in case I've missed anything, you want to ask some questions there?
Yeah, absolutely. I brought this on screen for a second. You belong at CIBC. We value diversity in thought, background, and experience as we strive to make an impact in the communities we serve. It's funny how all the values on their website, it's like, well, if you're not vaccinated, like this doesn't apply to you. You're no.
Yeah. So it's a lot of these large corporate companies, they'll have their values, and I think most people can kind of know that they don't always live and breathe them. And certainly seeing how my situation was handled, I certainly don't think they did. But at least there definitely are people within the bank, within other banks who were good people, good colleagues that I enjoyed working with, good
Sure.
teams. I thought we did good work, but yeah, it's sad to see that they plaster these values all over, but they won't live them, right? And again, it was not that I wouldn't complete it. I wasn't going to agree without just some valid questions. They say you need to agree to testing as a condition of employment, and I said, who pays for it? And they said, you might have to. And I'm like, okay, so then if I'm paying for it, if I don't have a test that week, could I get disciplined for it? If they're out of stock, what do I do? Like all these, like, you're just thinking ahead, right? Like, what are all these implications? And they wouldn't answer. So like, how could someone agree, right, to terms that are vague and unclear, right? It's like contract law 101, right? If you're making amendments or creating a contract, it has to be clear and unambiguous. Like, you can't have vague language in a contract. That's not how it works, particularly if you're making changes. So yeah, it was really just bizarre, the whole thing. And I still can't wrap my head around it that they actually operated this way, and their lack of communication, their lack of understanding or empathy. Like, I was telling them that this is causing a tremendous amount of stress, that I was losing sleep over it, right? Not sure if I was going to lose my job that I worked, pretty tirelessly over 10 years of my career to get to. So that kind of brought us to December. So I don't know, do you want me to keep going with the timeline here, or before we come?
Let me just jump in here for a sec. So for those who might just be joining us, this is Austin Cisco. He is an HR professional. He knows a lot about employment laws. Well, he essentially was working at CIBC and was bringing up just some very valid questions when it comes to the vaccine mandate. And of course, there was this attestation that was given to employees, which is essentially a certified legal document to say, not just, and this is kind of an important thing that we kind of skimmed over, like, it was presented as, hey, can you just fill this out to let us know if you got jabbed or not, or if you prefer not to disclose. But you noticed, being an HR professional, being somebody who's looking at the details, that it looks like I actually, or whoever signs this or agrees to this, also might be agreeing to a bunch of other kind of stuff in the fine print, i.e. you agree to have a booster shot no matter what happens in the future. You agree to any health and safety guideline in the future. And the major important issue there is, if you do confirm this attestation, even if you didn't get vaccinated, you might be confirming, we're going to fire you for cause. So you don't get any severance or anything like that. Yeah. But
so I guess just on that note, right, which is some of the, like, I'm just looking at some of the notes that I'd sent them and what I was asking. Right, like I was even asking them about, like, what is the medical exemption process, right? Who manages it? For all they know, that I could have had a medical disability that I just did not want to disclose, but I was curious about what the process was, in response to that. And I wasn't getting straight answers, so I specifically said, if anything can be confirmed, I would like to know in writing if adherence to our enhanced protocols, specifically testing, is now a condition of employment, and what the repercussions are for not following the guidelines. You shared that an unpaid leave is a likely outcome, which I feel is constructive dismissal. If this is the approach, then proper notice of the changes to the conditions of employment must be provided, right? So anytime you make changes to someone's conditions of employment, you need to give proper notice, right? So it would go, even if, let's say, you worked in Scarborough and now we needed to move you to the Mississauga office, that's a change, right? You're changing the location of where someone needs to show up to work. You would need to give them notice, right? You need to give them 3, 6, 12 months notice, possibly, depending on their tenure, of this change. And when you make those changes, it has to be very clear, right? There can't be any, or if it's not clear, you answer the questions, which they weren't doing, right? So, and I told them I felt it's constructive dismissal, which basically, just for the listeners, constructive dismissal is effectively when an employer changes the conditions or working arrangements such that the employee feels they have to resign. So an obvious example would be if I was like a senior executive leader, managing a large team, working in a nice downtown office, and then they stripped me of my team and they moved me to like the basement in North York. And they said, this is where you got to work now, right? It's demoting me. It's kind of changing my level of responsibility. So I could see is you could make the argument that, hey, they're changing these conditions, which is forcing me to resign, right? So that's what I thought constructive dismissal was. But ultimately... Yep.
And constructive dismissal is like at the fault of the employer. And is it not
that they've made these changes and I had no other option but to resign? Like, you forced me to resign, right? Or forced me to quit.
But this is something that you can, like, in terms of litigation, like, you can kind of say, hey, yeah. So this is
Yeah, you can make that claim and go after them for constructive dismissal. You can go after them for wrongful dismissal as well, depending on the nature of how you were ultimately terminated. With constructive dismissal to work, the individual usually has to like resign and then present the case that you forced me to resign, right? I didn't do that. I did not resign. I just kept asking questions. I kept exercising my rights. I kept doing what I thought was the right thing and the professional thing to do, which was, hey, I have concerns about what you're asking me. I have valid questions. Can you just please answer the questions? And if you can't, then I can't agree, right? And again, this whole thing is while I was working from home, right? Like, and yes, there were talks about returning to the office, right? So that gets us to kind of December. So maybe I'll just kind of finish off the timeline here.
Before we go into that, we've kind of gone over everything that's wrong with the policies that they were kind of pushing down. You were asking questions, they weren't answering. We'll get to kind of the final part of the chapter where you ended up being terminated and you tried to escalate things. But before that, tell me about, because you mentioned that there was a Bankers for Freedom group. I wanted to ask about like who else were you talking to who worked at CIBC or worked at other major banks? So like, and what did that look like? And tell me, there must have been a culture of not like secrecy, but a culture of like, we can't really be having this conversation that publicly.
A culture of fear. People were quite worried. So I guess to answer your question is that there were some people internally, like colleagues of mine, who I spoke with privately about my situation, looking for advice. They kind of understood. They understood my concerns about the attestation. A few of them were like, "Oh, I never read it that way," but yeah, maybe you're right. Like maybe it is. Maybe you are agreeing to future stuff, including boosters. And they said, "Oh, I never thought of it that way." They just thought of it as a, "Hey, we just need some information. We're doing it for health and safety. Just submit your attestation, and you'll be good." So I had some colleagues empathize, but none who were willing to speak up either. Right, to say, "Hey, like, I also don't agree with this," or "I don't." I suspect there were some, but I think most were afraid, did not want to speak up. We did not have very good, we call it ESAT, employee satisfactory surveys. We did not have very good ESAT results within HR at the time. Primarily, that was kind of a culture of just not being kept in the loop with stuff, right? Not being informed in advance. People were getting frustrated. So I didn't really have, in terms of my actual network of people who knew me for me within the bank, I did not have many people aware of my situation or many people on my side. But fortunately, there was a large percentage of people within CIBC and other banks who were connecting offline, right? So we were connecting through groups on Telegram, Instagram, Facebook, wherever, right? Just saying, "Hey guys, like, is this happening to you? What are we going to do? Like, should we get a lawyer? Should we challenge it? Like, should we speak up? Like, I'm afraid to lose my job. Like, what if I speak up and then they fire me?" Mm-hmm. And this was coming from people who all had a different life experience than me, right? Some of them had kids, some of them had mortgages, where they had a different line in the sand with me than I did, right? My line in the sand was, I'm not going to complete the attestation because I'm not going to like play the game and agree that they should even be able to ask it because it's not required for the job. So I'm not going to agree to that. I'm not going to agree to testing or mask use, if it means getting terminated. Where some of them, they said, "Well, hey, I can still keep my job even if I'm unvaccinated, but I have to agree to testing and mask use," which none of them were comfortable with. They felt coerced. But some of them felt like they couldn't afford to not have a paycheck, right? Like it directly impacts your livelihood if you get terminated. And if you have kids, you have a mortgage, like I said, some of them just had to comply. Right. So we connected with people. We explored different options. We spoke to lawyers about what to do, what we should do. Ultimately, a lot of people just kind of went their own path with what they felt was best for them, which I respect. But certainly there was a culture of fear, of worry, like tears on calls, people being upset, like "Oh my God, my life's going to be, what do I do?" Right. So it was a very stressful time. And certainly myself, not getting the answers and knowing kind of my rights and being in HR, I still couldn't figure things out. So I can only imagine those who maybe weren't aware of how the interworkings go and what their rights are and how they can escalate. Right. So it was honestly a shitty time for a lot of people, but I met some really great people throughout it. I have a good community of folks I connect with now. But yeah, there was lots, and not just within CIBC, but other banks. We would meet at certain protests, right? Just meet there in person, get to meet them. But ultimately, like I said, everyone kind of had their own line in the sand with what they were willing to do to either keep their job or to hold firm. And other people had different, like some people were in the office, right? Some of them were bank tellers, right? Which they have they're in the office. It's a whole different ball game than me who work from home. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, definitely. And on top of all this, you are a high performing employee. You were telling me how you met your not your targets, but you had a sort of a bonus incentive, and even though you were getting let go working at home, they still gave you a raise before you went.
So like for anyone listening, if they're like, oh, there's more to the scenes, or Austin was a bad employee, or he rubbed people the wrong way, there was some other reason, I never have once been disciplined in my entire career. I've never even had a off the record, hey, like we're worried you can't do this sort of chat. I've always been professional. I've always felt like I've done the right thing. I performed to expectations.
Yeah.
You know, I've gotten my bonus every year.
So these emails that you're sending your higher ups, you're not posting a bunch of like Alex Jones like links and stuff like this, like all caps. Hey, it's there's.
No, it's just I was asking them like I said, why is natural immunity not discussed? I had COVID, and I've had antibody tests. So like, can we talk about that? And the fact that I'm even having to ask them about it doesn't make any sense because I can do the job at home, right? And that's the whole thing that's bizarre, right? Is that the job was being done from home. If the virus, or if in a pandemic that if the virus is that deadly that it requires your employer to impose the most extreme measures against their staff, right? Because it's so dangerous. Why would you even entertain bringing them into the office when they can do the job from home, right? When we're talking health and safety, it does, logically it just falls apart. It doesn't make any sense, right? Like, why would you even expose them to it?
Yeah.
Right. And vaccinated included. Like let them stay home too. Right. And I said that there's you could test. I'm like, or you could test everyone, right? Then hey, everyone going into the office gets tested, right? And they said it was a logistics and a supply chain issue, right? That they couldn't get enough tests. I'm like, well, that's not my fault. Like, so what? We're going to put more people at risk in the office because you can't afford testing or can't get enough supply? Like, just let people work.
Even by their logic, it doesn't really make sense.
No, so again, like once I found out that failing to complete the attestation was going to lead to unpaid leave, I said, well, at this point, it's coercion. That's a threat. I'm under duress and I can't consent, right? Like you've basically said, agree to these terms, right? Which include testing, mask use, etc., and potentially future policies. Agree, like sign here, agree, or be placed on unpaid leave, right? So to me, like that's a threat. Like how could I, reasonably agree to that again without them answering the questions I had? Right, with an unpaid leave looming over my head.
All right. So let's get into the final chapter here. So essentially, you're asking these questions about this kind of mandate that's coming down on all the employees. And one of your questions was, hey, am I going to lose my job if I don't, consent to this? And you didn't get a clear answer on that. And if I'm not mistaken, you were saying that, there's the mandate, there was the deadline to submit this attestation to confirm whether you're vaxxed or not. That deadline passed 3 weeks or more. And then you get an email because you're asking questions about this. You finally get an email from like a higher up VP who's like, oh yeah, you're going to lose your job if you don't do this. And this is after the deadline of filling this out. Yeah. So you finally get an answer.
Right. So the deadline passed on October 31st, right? Leading up to that deadline, there was no confirmation what that would mean if you didn't complete it, if you said I choose not to disclose. Like there was no communication. And they said, okay, we'll let you know what these policies are. So eventually those policies came out. Again, I found out about the policies through our normal communication channels. They didn't reach back out to me to say, hey, understand you had some concerns. Here's what's going to be happening. Here's what it applies to you. Do you want to talk about it? Nothing like that. I had to follow up with them saying, hey, I'm hearing that, there's going to be policies around testing and mask use and this and that. I'm like, I'm still not comfortable signing the attestation. And then one of my executives said, completing the attestation is a condition of employment, as is adhering to our health and safety protocols. The option to indicate you prefer not to answer on the attestation with respect to your status, but not completing the attestation is not an option, and not following the protocols is also not an option. And it was, as a reminder, the mandatory announcement was made on October 20th this year, 3 months ago. But again, that was vague. So they said, they said they can understand the situation is causing me stress. And then they said, let me address the first point about completing the attestation, but they ignored every other question I had. Right. So it just became this back and forth of me saying, hey, I appreciate you saying this, but you're still not answering my questions. I've asked them. I can't consent. I said, I understand the attestation has a section to say prefer not to disclose, but by responding in this fashion still stipulates that I agree to protocols/requirements to follow, which are still unclear. How is one expected to agree to future protocols that are not announced in detail? Valid question, right? So it was just this back and forth. And then basically early December, I got a notice from a generic mailbox basically stating that, my completion of the attestation is overdue. If I don't agree to these terms and complete it, I may be placed. And again, they started using, very unsettling language because it wasn't definitive. It was always like you may be or you could. Right. So they said you'll receive a formal discipline letter and subject to added requirements, including an unpaid leave of absence in January 10. So finally, they did say you will be placed on unpaid leave. And the reason why it was January for the unpaid leave, just to give context to people listening, was in November and December, those who were working from home, the higher ups were working on a return to office plan. Right. So they were trying to figure out when is everyone coming back to the office. So for HR, they said, we think everyone's going to come back in January. That was the target. So in their mind, it was, hey, you need to agree to these policies, right? Because you're going to have to wear a mask in the office and we be tested to come into the office. So they said, if you don't agree to that, come January, when everyone comes back into the office, you will be delinquent, right? You will have not agreed. And you'll either show up untested, unmasked, and that's a violation as per their definition, or I don't show up to work, and that's like insubordination, right? So you can see their logic, right? That's why they were pushing toward this deadline of January to say, hey, you need to complete the attestation or you go on unpaid leave.
Because of the return to office coming up.
That was right, because their view was that, hey, you need to do testing. We feel you need to be tested to come into the office. And if you haven't agreed to the testing, then you're violating the health and safety protocols that we've defined.
Yeah, and to clear it up for our everyone listening, everyone was pretty well. You said 80% of people were working from home throughout this time, like August.
80% of people were working at home. 80%. Very few people were in the office through the pandemic. Even the public health guidance that we all heard for every industry was, if you are in a position that can be done from home, you must be doing it at home, right? Like only jobs that should be done in the office or on site are jobs that literally can't be done elsewhere, right? Like a nurse can't be a nurse at home. A bank teller can't be a teller at home, right? So majority of people were working remotely, right? So they had this return to office date set for January, and that's kind of what the push was to say, hey, you need to complete the attestation by December 31st, or you'll be placed on unpaid leave. So that was kind of their final ultimatum. They said, well, again, you're asking me, sign here and agree to this or else. And I'm like, that's a threat, that's coercion. At this point, I was under a tremendous amount of kind of psychological stress, not sleeping very well, not eating very well, just not, again, because it was more frustrating, I think, just the lack of communication, right? That they just blatantly were ignoring my questions, which again, very valid.
And it sounds like also, you have a job to do as an HR professional, and
I was doing my job through all of this.
Right? Yeah, and on top of that, you are taking the time to craft these emails towards your higher ups to ask these questions as well, and that's kind of its own effort in and of itself. And instead of kind of being rewarded with answers, it's just kind of being deferred, deflecting the answers, and then you get a robo email that's like, complete this or you will lose your job.
Yeah. So the ironic part was the announcement about my unpaid leave happened early December. At this point in time, when that announcement came, the plan was still for me and my colleagues in HR to return to the office in January. Mid-December, a corporate-wide decision, all the banks, pretty much every industry said, hey, anyone who's returning to the office, we need to halt. Omicron's kind of out of control. We're not going to expose our employees to that risk. All return to office plans are going to be pushed out to the spring. So they said, hey, Austin, you're not coming back in January. And I said, oh, that's great. At least that buys us time, right? Because if I'm not returning to the office, then I'm not violating these policies because if I'm not going into the office, I don't need to be tested. I don't need to be masked. So maybe we can spend more time kind of going into the questions, understanding my concerns, or even if we wind up at the exact same, point where we disagree and it leads to my dismissal, at least it's like 3 months from now, or at least when it's, all of their logic is flawed, at least it's when it meets their own kind of justification, right? So I was like, there's no reason to terminate me now or put me on unpaid leave, right? No one's going back into the office.
Yeah.
And they said, no, we're still going to proceed.
Yeah.
We're still going to put you on unpaid leave in January. And I thought, but for what, right? Like, yes, you want me to complete the attestation. I have questions about it, but even what I'm agreeing to in that attestation will not be in place in January. It'll be in place, when we come back in May or April or whenever it ended up being. So they still decided to proceed. And I thought that was insane. Right? Yeah. It makes no sense. Particularly as you mentioned, in December, I got more than my target bonus for doing a good job and performing well. I got a raise that was effective January as well, right? An annual raise for doing a good job. And we were short-staffed, and our clients desperately needed, like, and I say clients, I mean like in the people I supported internally, they needed help, right? And when they found out I was leaving, they were like, what? Like, who's going to cover for you? There's been so much turnover and change within HR. Like, this is going to be disruptive to us. Like, why can't they just let you work from home? And I was like, I don't know. I don't have a good answer for you on that. So when I found out that they would be kind of proceeding with my unpaid leave, I felt I'm like, I still need to escalate this. This is not right. At this point, when you've repeatedly asked someone to agree to new terms of employment, and you failed to respond to their questions, you blatantly disregarded their queries about the legality of it, how this impacts me, what am I agreeing to, right? Like the responses were like, to me, it's like psychological harassment, right? You're at the point where it's sign here or be threatened with unpaid leave or threatened with dismissal when the employee is just asking valid questions and they're just disregarding it, right? Like you can imagine it's like sign here or you're fired, sign here or you're fired. But you have questions and they go unresponded to. So I told them, like, this is like psychological harassment, right? It's causing me to lose sleep. I'm incredibly stressed, feeling more anxious. I had to uproot my life because of it. So all these things that were incredibly impactful to me at the time. And I thought, okay, like, where else can I go, right? Like I've tried with my one-ups. I've tried with my higher ups, like my executive team, didn't go anywhere. So I did like I've kind of a last-ditch effort to maybe say, okay, maybe the Ombudsman, right, can deal with this. Right. So the Ombudsman should be an impartial kind of body within a corporation that basically is there as kind of a fail-safe to investigate any wrongdoing, misconduct, fraud, embezzlement, harassment, whatever it is. If you need someone who's kind of impartial, because they're not supposed to report into the same structure of the company, they would report, to the board of directors or someone very senior that's, a peer to the CEO type of thing.
And this is literally why an ombudsman exists, right? To hold.
They deal with employee escalations. They deal with client escalations. Like, let's say if you're a client and you felt that something sketchy was going on with who you were dealing with internally, like they were breaking the law, they were doing something wrong, whatever, you go to the Ombudsman, right? And they're supposed to be kind of like that third party. You can Google what an Ombudsman is, what their function is in most companies. So I went to them, right? Because again, if I went the normal channel that I would for any other type of harassment complaint or any issue, it would go to HR and to ER, which is employee relations. But the problem is HR, myself, and ER reports to the same people that I'm having the issues with, right? So they're not an impartial, right? If you're asking, a team to investigate the very people that you report to, it's like, it's like if I got asked to investigate my boss, it's kind of like there's a direct conflict there, right? I'm not gonna go at my boss because I could risk losing my job, right? They're not impartial. So I went to the Ombudsman, just said, guys, like, what are we doing here? This doesn't make sense. They're not answering my questions. This is psychological harassment. They're just saying sign here or else. Like, can you just look into it? Someone third party who's not involved in the decision making, some guidance. They met with me on Christmas Eve. That was the only date that they could make to meet with me, which is not ideal, right? You going into Christmas, rehashing this again. I was having to explain, like, here's everything I've said. Here's all my concerns. Right.
Here's all my unanswered questions. my long list of valid unanswered questions.
Here's a list of every question I've asked, and here's either the answers they've given or just no answer at all. And even the answers they gave were often like not really answers, right? They were just the political kind of, circular type of response that you would get when you ask them the same thing.
All the other banks are doing it. Health and safety. We need to keep everyone safe.
Legal would have looked into it. I'm sure, it wouldn't have been decided upon if legal didn't sign off and all this other stuff. And right. So it was this thing. So Ombudsman met and they said, well, look, it's not for us to investigate. Employee Relations Special Services needs to, right? So they're a dedicated team that deals with, harassment, discrimination, the more sensitive type of complaints. And I said, well, they can't investigate a harassment complaint. Like they report to the people that I'm saying are making the policies that are harassing me, right? That are putting me in this weird position of sign here or else, sign here or else. But lo and behold, they still did. They still put me, they still had them investigate. And basically they did not investigate. They just said, reviewed the facts and they said, this is clear and obvious not to be harassment. We're sorry you feel that way, right? This is just verbatim. We're sorry you feel that way, but we're still proceeding. We still felt this is justified and you're going to be put on leave, right? I said, but you, even if that's the decision you made, like the person who was responding to me, it's a direct conflict of interest. So that's a whole other thing in terms of kind of litigation and what banks and obligations that they have to do with respect to harassment complaints that I think that they've failed to do. But ultimately, that escalation went nowhere. But at least it's documented on their end that I did submit the complaint, that I did, again, share my concerns. And then ultimately, the first week of January came, which was ironically, my last day of employment at the bank would have been January 7th. I think it was a Friday. It was my 3rd year anniversary, like the date, like the day. 3 years from the date. And on my last day, just to kind of give you a sense of the tone deafness, that's not really the right word, but just how tone deaf the organization was in my team meeting of me, my boss, my dozen colleagues or so, or however many were on the call. My boss recognized me in front of my colleagues for completing 3 years of service, knowing that Monday I would be on unpaid leave.
Wow.
So she goes, hey, I just want to recognize that Austin's been here for 3 years and what a great accomplishment that is. But everyone's like clapping and colleagues are like, oh, it's such a pleasure working with you. Here's to 3 more years, or, all this like nice accolades. Like, hey, it's been great working with you.
And he's being unpersoned next week as well. Do they talk about that part? How you're going to get let go?
They didn't mention it, right? And they just said,
but they knew.
My boss knew for sure, because she knew at that point. Like, again, she was not making the decision. She was just having to execute and do her job. So I don't fault her. Like it's, been there for a long time.
It still feels very icky and kind of inhuman.
I just didn't. I thought it was a bad taste. Of like, why are you calling out? I've been here for 3 years, knowing that on Monday I'm going to be on unpaid leave, and everyone's going to start asking, like, where did Austin go? What happened? Like, where is he? Is he coming back? Like, we need help. We're short-staffed. Like, who's going to cover?
That's very
who's going to cover his portfolio? Right? It's 1,000 employees or so that I was covering. So it was just that, and then I got put on unpaid leave on the Monday. And then basically from there, I got 2 warning letters while on unpaid leave saying, you've continued to not complete the attestation and agree to these new terms, right, including testing, masks, etc., which we feel violates our code of conduct and following the law. And they list all the policies that they say I'm violating. And then ultimately it was terminated for cause in February 3rd.
What's the cause? Insubordination. Right.
Their cause was insubordination and not adhering to their requirement to maintain a healthy and safe workplace, which again, I'm working from home, so I haven't even violated the policies they're referencing. Had we all gone back into the office in January, I could see them saying, well, you didn't agree, you need to be tested to come in, you didn't do that, so now you violated it. But at the time when they said I was violating it, I was working at home, right? Like no one in my team had gone back in. So it was almost like being reprimanded for future violations, right? So was ended up terminated for cause. And for anyone who's listening who's unfamiliar with the different types of terminations, there's effectively termination for cause and termination without cause. I can't even count how many terminations without cause in my career, like being the HR person delivering the news. And usually that's like corporate restructuring, layoffs, outsourcing, right? The employee didn't do anything wrong. They just were in the wrong role at the wrong time and we cut their role. But in a termination without cause, You still get severance, right? You're still going to get payment, right, for years of service to compensate you till you find a job. You're still eligible for employment insurance benefits through the government if you lose your job through no fault of your own in a without cause termination. But a for cause or with cause termination, it's effectively the capital punishment of employment law, right? It is reserved for the most egregious actions by an employee, right? Assault, right? You go punch a colleague, or egregious harassment or sexual harassment, that's termination for cause. You steal, termination for cause. You do fraud, right? Like things that are very severe, and determining cause and actually terminating someone for cause is a very, very high threshold and high bar to meet. And I've only done a handful of them in my career, where someone employee did something so egregious that we terminate them for cause. And the reason you say it's capital punishment is because if you get terminated for a cause, you get nothing. You get no severance, but you get no payment from your employer. Everything stops the day you get terminated, and you are ineligible for employment insurance. So all the EI that I've paid into all those years, I couldn't even apply for EI, right? Because that's kind of the punishment. It was, you did something or ought to have known that it was going to be bad. You did a bad thing, and this is your punishment, which for egregious acts, it's kind of reasonable, right? If you were a pervert and you were sexually harassing people in the office and doing really nasty things, right, then you deserve to be terminated without pay, right? That's kind of assuming
Sure.
you can prove cause, right? So I was terminated for cause, no payment, no EI, nothing, just kind of on my own to look for work.
That's crazy. So essentially, asking questions as an HR professional about a vaccine mandate is now on the same par as a sexual harassment in a way. They're kind of equating it.
Right? Like they equated it to that, when, even when you think of termination for cause, you have to look at, like, were there reasonable alternatives? And throughout the entire, from when they made the announcement of the mandate to when I was terminated, there were so many simple alternatives that could have at least, minimized my concerns, right? If they had decided to test everyone, I'd say, okay, that's not, it's still invasive. I don't really agree, but at least it's not discriminatory, because you're saying, hey, Greg, you're vaccinated, you do a test. Austin, you do a test.
Right.
Or if they made it voluntary, right? To say, hey, if you want to come back into the office, you need to be tested to be on site, which sure, fair, but you can choose to work from home, right? Like, because you can work from home, your job can be done from home. Right. So there were so many opportunities, or just to say, hey, you're not coming back to the office yet. Let's just pause. Things are changing fast. And ultimately, what's ironic is all of the policies that I was raising concerns about and was not agreeing to, right? The mask use, the testing, that sort of stuff, were dropped in, I think, April or May. You can probably find it online. Anyone who can Google it, they can figure the exact date. And my colleagues, I think, went back to the office in like April. So there might have been like a 1 month period that they could have just let me work from home, and then they dropped everything, right? And there's a reason why they dropped everything, because it didn't make sense. It wasn't really serving its purpose as creating a health and a safe work environment for their staff. So that's kind of where it led me, and it's the whole thing is unfortunate. I thought I was doing the right thing with raising my concerns. I thought I had valid questions. I thought I was professional throughout, and it wasn't getting that, and it led to the most extreme form of termination, which is still just mind-boggling to me.
Absolutely. And Austin, good on you for speaking up and for standing up for what you believe in, because, we need more of that. And I think you're going to be sleeping better at night than the people who had to terminate you, because you had a question, you had a burning sort of, this doesn't sit right with me. And you were kind of coming forward to voice that. So, and
what's ironic is although I'm probably a rehire status no, right? If you terminate someone for cause, you put them as a no rehire, which means they'll never work at that company again. Oh. But what's ironic is, despite what had happened with my disagreements and the nature of my exit, as of today, I would be eligible to apply and work in the same job I had before. There was never an effort to have me come back to right the wrongs. I even told them via emails after my dismissal saying, guys, look, I know this is what you think now, but my view is that as time goes on, it will look even more noxious and silly what we did, but it's never too late to do the right thing. Like, we can fix this. Like, I will accept an apology. I'll accept them trying to right the wrong and do correct themselves in doing the right thing, but no efforts are made, right? There's not going to be an admission of guilt or any kind of acknowledgement that what they did was wrong or maybe not the right decision, which to me is really unfortunate because like I for me as a person and kind of how I am, like if I mess up, I do something wrong, I'll say it. We all do things in certain times in our life that we think is the right thing. And after we look back, we're like, yeah, maybe not the right thing. But no efforts on their part. And it's ironic that I could still be working there if they just let me work from home. But it kind of brought us to where we are now, which, I think in the long run, maybe for the best. I would not have been able to sleep comfortably if I agreed to things that I really felt uncomfortable agreeing to, and having that kind of compromise, for my own values and morals just was not the right thing.
Yeah. What was your egregious offense? It was being a diligent HR professional.
Right. Like
that's it.
I just asked questions, and the questions I asked, again, like the reason coming on this with you was like all these people hear about people being terminated and their things. It's like, yeah, well, you were in a high risk setting, right? No one I've spoken to about where I've explained the details of my situation goes, yeah, they were justified in doing that. Like other colleagues of mine, HR professionals, executives, different industries, they're like, wait, working from home. And they're like, wait, were you going back into the office? I'm like, no, not even that. Right. So there's no, like, I haven't met a single person that's like, yeah, you know what, like you had a choice, you did this, you could have just done that. Like, yes, some people are like, why wouldn't you have agreed to testing? And I'm like, but it's not required, right? It's the principle. Right. Again, because what if if you agree to that and it's not required for the job, what's them stopping from saying, hey, we want to do blood work. We want to make sure you're healthy, right? We want to, you need to submit blood work once a month as a condition of employment. We want to make sure you're healthy.
And that's so important over the past 2 years, and why, I think it's important to speak up about this stuff, because it's like this is setting a really creepy precedent on so many different fronts. And so once again, good on you for speaking up on it. Thank you for sharing your story. We've been going for an hour and 15, and I want to kind of, being a professional human resources person, let's talk about the people who might be watching, who might still be in one of these corporate environments. What advice do you have for employees, especially in a big corporate environment or in general? Maybe there's somebody, for example, who has confirmed this attestation. What should they look out for? What options do they have? What do you think? What do you think moving forward for people?
Yeah, so I think just generally speaking, advice for those who work in a large corporate setting. I got to where I was in my career working in large corporate. I don't regret the career path I've taken. I've learned a lot, worked with a lot of great people. It certainly has given me the experience and the knowledge that I hold today because of those companies that I worked at, like IBM, Rogers, and more recently CIBC. Although I would say, anyone who works in a large corporate environment knows that it's a different type of culture than if you work in a small company or a family-run business, whatever. And the advice I have is just, be mindful of what you say and who you say it to. Optics in large corporate environment are very important. Appearances are very important. They certainly prefer the status quo most of the time. And I think anyone who's listening, who's worked in a large corporate environment, knows that they are reluctant to change, that they just kind of want, don't rock the boat, keep it the same. And the reality is if you're kind of the type of person to kind of go along with things and just do your job, head down, whatever, you can succeed and make good money and have a great career in a large corporate environment. But there will be times where you will have to compromise on either kind of your values, kind of your opinions, whatever, and just kind of agree, right? Just to kind of, not put a target on your back. Right. To me, like I could have kept my job if I just complied and agreed and said, hey, I'm going to agree to testing, even though I felt it was an overreach and not required for the job. I could have kept it, right? But to me, I couldn't in good conscience do that. I would say...
Did you feel this way before this whole scenario, where in order to work in a corporate environment, you do kind of have to bite your tongue at times and kind of keep a low profile? Well, not low profile, but...
Yes and no. Like I would say for me in my role, I started to feel that way. Like I left IBM primarily because it was like there wasn't a lot of growth in Canada, right? Like, IBM Canada is like 4% or 3% of IBM Global. So they're kind of an afterthought, not much growth. But I was also kind of getting frustrated with like, hey, like I have ideas, we can do things better. Why don't we do this? And things just kind of like don't happen, right? They don't change. So, I moved from there to Rogers to the bank thinking that, maybe it was the company, right? But to me, I started to realize it was that large corporate environment. Particularly being in HR, I would say I'm not your typical HR person. I think I have the right values around like what I think, we should be doing, what's right, what's wrong. Like I have a good moral compass in that sense to be in HR, but certainly there's an aspect of kind of virtue signaling and kind of that woke kind of culture that's sort of started to kind of make its way into the large corporate environment, particularly within HR, that I found myself like not agreeing to a lot of the things we were maybe doing or having to kind of roll out to our employees. But again, I was like, you know what, it pays well. The rest of my job is interesting. I like it. I'm good at what I do. So, I'll just deal with it. But there were certainly things leading up to the whole kind of COVID, vaccine mandate that was making me uneasy. And just certain things of kind of examples of it. Like I became aware of an instance of an employee at the bank who was reprimanded and given a warning letter for a comment that they made on Instagram. And to me, I thought, well, wait a second, like, were they making a comment to a colleague of theirs? Was it related to the bank? Like, what was it? It was none of those things, right? It was, they made a comment on an Instagram post about a public figure, questioning kind of like, just saying, hey, it had to do with sexual assault. And they said, hey, it's, this person should have, basically the employee said this person, the woman should have known who they were dealing with, right? Like, you might have mentioned, like if I went on a date with OJ Simpson and he like tried to hurt me, people would be like, dude, like, what were you thinking? But someone read that, thought it was victim shaming, which sure, you can interpret it that way, sent it to the bank. They investigated it and they reprimanded the employee. And to me, I asked the question, was it done on company time? No. Was it done on a company asset? No. Is the individual on their social media linked to the company in any way, right? Are they speaking on behalf? People on Twitter, they say where they work. And if you say where you work, you got to be a bit more mindful because there could be
sure.
You're speaking on behalf of the company.
Was there a photo where they're like wearing a CIBC shirt or something like that?
No, nothing like that. There was no linkage, right? So basically it was, and the person they were making the comment about was not related to the bank. The person who complained, to my knowledge, was not an employee, right? So there was no linkage. So basically it would be, it's a freedom of speech thing, right? They said something in a public space, which is Instagram, and someone got offended and sent it to the bank, and this employee got reprimanded for it, right? This is
wild. This is wild.
It would be like if I was driving into the office, and I let's say I flip someone off, I give them the finger, right? That person follows me, and they're really upset. They're like, that was mean, that was rude, you shouldn't have done that. And then they just go knock on the door and they tell my employer, they say, Austin flipped me off on the road in. And like, imagine that employer like reprimanding me for it, right? It's like, does that have anything to do with my job? Does it have anything to do with my performance? Any of that? No. And to make matters worse, the employee apologized to us saying, I didn't mean to victim shame. That's not what I meant. I was just thought I was stating the obvious that this person in this article is not they're not a Jonas brother, right? Like, they just, and then they got reprimanded for it. And when you get a warning letter, it impacts your bonus, right? So to me, it's just like when I saw that kind of example and heard that example happening, I was like, this is kind of where it starts, right? And this is kind of the extreme version of this kind of overly sensitive kind of woke culture that a lot of these companies are kind of experiencing and that people are seeing, right? If this kind of thing happened, if they made that comment in a work meeting to a colleague, sure, right? Then there's context of it within work, right? It would be, like if you look at porn on a company laptop, you can't do that, but it'd be like, someone complaining that you looked at porn on your personal laptop and got you in trouble for it. It's like, there's no linkage between the personal life and work for there to be a valid complaint, right? So it doesn't make any sense. So I guess, to answer your question about was I feeling kind of this way, with not agreeing with the direction of the kind of large corporate environment. I was starting to feel that way, but I certainly was still a dedicated employee, wanted to keep working, was still learning a lot in my role, right, which I thought was helping me round out as an HR professional. But certainly there was more evidence of these types of things starting to happen.
Wow. So someone made an Instagram comment and not associated with the brand, not associated with the company, and then somehow this is pretty well cancel culture, but except it's enforced By not really much other than someone complaining to the company, to the corporate entity.
Yeah, there was no linkage between the employee's personal life and that conduct and work, as far as I was aware. And it was just, I couldn't believe it. The employee could not believe it either. They were like.
Hopefully, this is a rare case. Hopefully, this isn't like a.
Yeah, I did not see like this is like a theme or happen regularly. But keep in mind, I worked in just a small subset of the bank supporting the people I did, and wouldn't be privy to all the other stuff going on. And again, if someone does any kind of misconduct at work or does something anything inappropriate, I'm not insensitive to that stuff. In fact, I do think we look into it, and we do have a right, an obligation to investigate and make sure it was handled properly. But for things that people do in their personal life that have nothing to do with work, right? Like even unless it impacts your ability to do your job, like let's say you get a DUI, yes, that's personal, but it's criminal, and you might need a car to drive into the office. Then it becomes our business, sure.
Yeah, but something sharing an opinion on pop culture, yeah, that's a little different.
Sure, maybe it's offensive, maybe it's in bad taste, but it wasn't like an anti-Semitic comment. It wasn't something that was like attacking someone or calls to violence or anything that could be viewed as illegal. It was just it was a comment that someone got upset about. Which, sure, like I read the comment, I was like, yeah, it's in bad taste. But like, what does this have to do with their job?
What does this have to do with us? Yeah, with our job.
It has nothing to do with us. So yeah,
I could see if it was like a guy in a CIBC shirt posting a video of like, hey, here's my opinion on immigration, and it's like, did you have to wear the CIBC shirt for that? But
there was no linkage whatsoever. So like things like that, I'm like, that's a bit unsettling. And then obviously, leading to the behavior that I saw, that I personally experienced with asking questions, valid questions, right? Like the logic that they followed that led to my dismissal was just it's broken in so many ways. But I shouldn't be surprised, right, based on what I was starting to see.
All right. So we're almost at an hour and a half here, but I do want to ask you kind of one final question just to wrap it up here. Well, I guess a couple of questions. Are you going to be, fighting this, what happened at CIBC? Are you going to be taking some legal efforts? That's question one. And then also, how has your life changed since this all happened?
Sure. So in terms of the legal side, like I won't get into too much detail there. Certainly, I feel I'll still take whatever avenues I need to right this wrong. Where things are at in that process, I'm not going to get into. But certainly at a later date, if there's some sort of resolution or it becomes more widely known, we can talk about it and how that all goes. But for now, certainly I'm not just going to accept what happened. And even talking with you here, I'm just sharing my thoughts, the truth, my side of the story, and kind of what happened to me, and more, to just bring more light to it. Certainly, if there's anyone listening who's gone through a similar circumstance and has had either success from a legal standpoint, please let me know. I recognize that everyone's situation is different, right? I was not terminated for being unvaccinated. I was terminated for not agreeing to new employment terms, which included testing, right? So there's a distinction there. And then the other question in terms of how my life has changed, basically a complete 180 in 12 months. So I worked through my 20s, basically thinking I would climb the corporate ladder. In my estimation, I had the skill, the EQ, the aptitude to be a senior employee at a corporate environment, whether director, executive level. That was kind of my target and career path. I'm like, yeah, I'll work my way up. I was a senior HR consultant, which is one pay grade below director level at the bank.
Nice.
So that's kind of where I thought I was going. But since this has all happened, I will no longer work in a large corporate environment, particularly if that company had any sort of mandate or similar behavior that the bank exhibited. I can't in good conscience, unless they've really pedaled it back and said, hey, this was wrong, and admitted it. So for me, how it's changed is I've had to leave Toronto. I had to move, which was a stressful time, and leave the city that I knew and loved with all my friends there. Went back to my parents' house for 6 months until I started to kind of figure out consulting and the work I was going to do going forward, and then moved to Calgary. So I'm out here. One of my good childhood friends lives in Calgary. He's been here for almost 7 or 8 years now. He's been bugging me to come out. So I moved, because I was at my parents' house, I was going to have to move again. So my option was back to Toronto, which is, anyone listening who's in the Toronto area knows cost of living is expensive there, knows how destructive the passports were, right, from September 22nd till March 13th or whatever the date was. In Toronto, in Ontario, I couldn't play hockey, I couldn't go to the gym, restaurant, bar, travel, any of that stuff. So for me, moving to Alberta, at least it's a bit more understanding of how those implications can be on people's lives. So I moved here, and now I've pivoted, and I always thought maybe at some point I would gain enough kind of corporate HR experience, learning from them, learning what works, what doesn't work, and then eventually apply that into my own kind of HR consulting. But that was something in my mind I had like 30s, 40s, start a business then. But since this happened, I've kind of had to pivot. I incorporated a consulting company earlier in 2022, and I've just been working as a private HR consultant with a couple clients in Toronto while I work from home. So anyone listening, if you're a technical person, like you have, your DevOps, software developer, solutions architect, tech lead, those type of roles, if you're skilled, and anything I've said has resonated with you in terms of my way of thinking, culture, like please be in touch with me. I might have some opportunities for you. But yeah, that's kind of how my life has changed. I uprooted my life in Toronto and did a 180, where I thought I would be in corporate HR for the better part of my career. And now I've had to kind of reevaluate and change and seeing where HR is going. I don't think I fit into those cultures very well anymore. So if there's anyone listening who's also in HR, who's not like woke and not, has common sense and a good moral compass, like please be in touch. I certainly,
how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah. So I'd say LinkedIn, even though I'm not a big fan of LinkedIn, it's too too many pats on the back for each other. It's like, I'm humbled to announce that I'm nice and humble. Like all these kind of, right. All these posts that are to me, it's a bit disingenuous, right? People just, post stuff. So I don't use LinkedIn for that, but I certainly use it to connect with people, with candidates for roles that I'm hiring for. So anyone who wants to connect with me, you can find me on LinkedIn, Austin Cisco, or if you type in Cisco HR, like Cisco HR, one word, that's my company name currently, Cisco HR Consulting. To be honest, it's a placeholder right now. I created this company very quickly. My logo was like Microsoft Paint. But at some point, when I figure out kind of what I want to narrow in with my consulting business and kind of think it through, I'll probably do a rebrand and a refresh and maybe hire some staff. But for now, it's just a placeholder. But you can find me at Cisco HR or Cisco HR Consulting on LinkedIn, or just find me like Austin Cisco. You'll see my profile. You'll see my picture. I think I'm wearing the sweater even. So that's how they can get in touch. But yeah, that's kind of how my life has changed in the last 12 months.
Wow. There it is on screen. Austin Cisco HR, or search Cisco HR to get in touch with our friend Austin here. Thank you for sharing all of that. Thank you for taking us through the nitty gritty and kind of giving us the play by play of dealing with these mandates and really standing up for the law, employment law, and employees everywhere. And I just thought of one last kind of question.
Sure.
How has it been, getting terminated when you're working from home for health and safety? Just seems so on its face ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of curious, your friends and family, because, I've had this has been like a very, very divisive time. Despite you going through this, what have you still had to deal with in terms of people who are just like, well, why don't you should have just got the jab anyway? Or like, why are you asking questions? Like, did you have to confront kind of like those sort of attitudes?
Yeah, a lot of it, like, my immediate family was fairly supportive. Like my mom was kind of like questioning, like, do you really want to do this? Like, are you really going to walk away from your job?
Is this the hill you're going to die on?
Yeah,
yes,
like stuff like,
yes, it is.
like kind of my thought was like, no, like I can't, you give an inch, they take a mile. And it's, I know what is right and I know what is wrong. I grew up with good parents who kind of instilled those values, and then working in HR for 10 years, particularly the type of roles that I've been in, I was exposed to so many employee issues, legal issues around harassment, discrimination, changes to employment contracts. All of my jobs, with the exception at CIBC, like when I was at Rogers and at IBM, was dealing with this stuff. So I felt like I had a good kind of calibrated sense of what was right and wrong. And I was like, what they're doing isn't right. So I can't in good conscience agree. But certainly I had to deal with, people not truly understanding why I was so opinionated and holding firm in it. But when I started to explain people the full context of like, I was working from home, this is how employment law works, this is how banks and all companies typically would have to operate for these types of changes, right? Any change to conditions of your employment have to be a requirement, have to be justified for the role. Most people were like, yeah, I understand. It doesn't make sense. And like no one, like, I think most people, when I explained to them the context in a longer setting, they were like, yeah, this is absurd. Like how did this even happen? Right. And I again, to this day, I still scratch my head. It's unfortunate. And I think that like if I had done something that I thought was wrong, let's say I stole money or I harassed someone, I did something egregious to warrant being terminated, I would own up to it, right? I would admit, hey, I messed up, I did something wrong, I deserve these, the repercussions for my actions. But it's just, I was working from home, right? Like that's the part that doesn't make any sense, right? And not only that is no one was going into the office, right? Like we've said many times.
And you kept your pants on when you were on Zooms calls all the time?
Oh wait, yeah.
Always?
Like I was standing up, bringing my camera to the bathroom, and be like, "Oops, I'm on the Zoom call." Like nothing. Like I said, I never was disciplined once in my career. Never even had a chat of like, "Hey, you shouldn't have done this." Like no even verbal warnings ever in my career. And even like I mentioned, like I was doing clearly enough of a job to get more than my target bonus in December and a raise in January, which like clearly suggests that there was no problem with my performance and my output. And even on the way out, my executives that I supported, my non-HR, like the business executives where I was their HR guy, they were all saying, you were such a pleasure to work with. Like even, hang on here. One sec.
Thanks for the super chat, Anonymous. Thank you, Greg and Austin. Thank you for keeping up, poking at the dialogue.
Like one of my executives said, I'm sad it came to this point. I hope you and them find some resolution in the coming days, which enables you to return. I love working with you. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know. Right. Like, and this was one of my business unit executives, right? Like, so there was they needed the help. They would have been fine to let me work from home, right? They're just like, we don't care if he's in the office, just like we need his support. Why are we going to shoot ourselves in the foot when we're short staffed? So the logic, it just falls apart all over. And that's, I think, what's the most upsetting is that like, I'm a reasonable, open-minded guy. I'll listen to people's sides. I even understand their logic to a point, but then some of it starts to fall apart. And it's just, that's, I think, what was the most frustrating and most upsetting was just that it didn't make sense. And I just, they weren't communicating. And I really did not think that was fair. So, but it's led us to where we are today. And hopefully, people see this and get in touch and reach out and maybe feel more empowered to stand up and speak their mind about their experiences and just, be mindful if you're in a corporate setting, just be mindful of what you say in and outside of work. It's not that they're a bad place to work. I think most of the places in a corporate setting, whether it's good or bad, depends very much on your immediate manager, right? If you have a good manager, it doesn't matter what bank you're at, what telecom, what tech company you're at. If you have a good boss, that's really what matters. So anyway, that's, I don't know if you have any other questions before we kind of wrap things up.
No, that's everything. Thanks again, Austin. You can look up Austin Cisco on LinkedIn if you have any questions or if you're seeking advice or if you're an HR professional, maybe you want to team up, anything like that. So
have advice, guidance on next steps, like anything, right? Like it's, just expand the network of people who've maybe been through kind of similar things like this. Or like I said, if you're a technical person and looking for a change and an employer that's not going to, play these sorts of games, I have some connections. So be in touch.
Awesome. Thanks again, Austin, so much for your time. And that's going to be it for the stream. But guys, if you want to support more content like this, there's information in the links below. I started a Patreon recently. I'm really hoping to keep content like this alive and do a lot more fun stuff and eventually hire editors so I can get more stuff out to you. But thanks again, Austin, for your time. And
thank you, Greg. Appreciate it. And just one last thing for you, like,
sure.
I've followed you for probably, a year and a bit now. Just seeing your little short clips that were good humor throughout. Nice. Certainly appreciate what you've done. It's a good way to, like, sometimes you just got to like fight it with humor, right? Like some of the skits you do, it's just, you point out how absurd the whole thing is, and it's been a good laugh. So I appreciate the work that you've been doing, man.
Thank you. It means a lot. And likewise, man, because it takes a lot of bravery to hop on a call like this and stand up to a big corporation. But
Yeah.
I think it speaks a lot to your character, because you are a professional, you are diligent, you know what you're talking about, and again, adds to the absurdity that they let you go. They let go of a really an asset to their company, obviously. But,
Yeah, it makes no sense. So if the bank's listening, you can always call me and we can reach a resolution.
Hey, CIBC, you heard it. Line's open. The line's open.
Hey, yeah, right. It's never too late to do the right thing and to fix the wrongs, in my opinion. So, we'll see where things go. I'll keep you and the listeners updated whenever things change or whenever it's officially resolved. But for now, we'll see.
Awesome. And with that, we will talk to you guys soon. Thanks.